Now to our subject at hand. I was asking Martin Siegel a little earlier about the Rosenbergs, and obviously he'll be talking about that in a moment, about how many people would know who the Rosenbergs were generationally. And he was sharing with me that our parents' generation would have been, what percentage did you say? Yeah, maybe 80, 90%. The generation beneath, I don't know what, there's obviously different representation numbers here, people in the 50s and 60s, maybe half, but the younger generation, even university students, who studying history or have an interest in history, don't necessarily know who the Rosenbergs were. And I remember when they used to say that the O.J. Simpson trial was going to be the trial of the century, I said, no. There's been a trial of the century, it's just you've all forgotten about who it is. Let me read to you a little bit about this evening. In 1951, world attention fixed on Judge Irving R. Kaufman's courtroom as its ambitious young occupant stridently blamed Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for starting the Korean War by handing the secret of the atomic bomb to Joseph Stalin. To many, the harsh sentences and their preening author left an enduring stain on American justice. But in Judgment and Mercy, this book, Martin J. Siegel upends this simplistic portrait of Judge Kaufman, showing how his path-breaking decisions desegregated a northern school for the first time, liberalized the insanity defense, reformed Attica-era prisons, spared John Lennon from politically motivated deportation, expanded free speech, brought foreign torturers to justice, and more. Now, those words, which I took from Mr. Siegel's website, instantly should whet our appetite to know more, and few people are better qualified to speak about it than he. You see, Mr. Siegel clerked for Judge Kaufman after graduating from Harvard Law School. He later served as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York and a staffer on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. Today, when he is not writing, and of course the book is available for purchase if you have not yet purchased it, and he will personalize them afterwards. When he's not writing, he practices law at the University of Houston Law Center, where he also directs the Appellate Civil Rights Clinic. How fortunate we are that he made the trip from Houston to be here just for us tonight. Please welcome Martin J. Siegel.
So I very much want to thank you guys for coming out tonight to hear me talk about this book. I really want to thank the rabbi and Stephen Wise, of course, for having me here. Can everybody hear me? Is that good? Up higher, okay. How about that? Even better? Okay,
We're not
good.
used to tall Jews.
Thank you, okay. So I'll repeat. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm going to begin by reading a short excerpt from the prologue. I don't want to read too much at you. It's only about 15 minutes or so. Then I'm going to speak a little more informally about the Jewish dimension, both of the Rosenberg case, but really more broadly of Judge Kaufman and his life story. And after that, hopefully some questions. So I'll begin with the prologue, The Funeral. On a freezing February morning in 1992, I left the tiny apartment I shared with an architect and his girlfriend near Washington Square and headed uptown. I was on a sad and surreal errand, my boss's funeral. He was a federal appellate judge on the bench for 40 years, and for the past 6 months, I'd been one of his 2 law clerks. Just out of law school, we analyzed cases for him, recommended how to rule, and wrote first drafts of the court's opinions. Heady stuff for 20-somethings still reeling from bar exams. But now we were filing past NYPD officers into the Moorish opulence of the Park Avenue Synagogue. We tiptoed around the dignitaries, former heads of the CIA and FBI, other judges, media bigwigs, and found seats in back. I don't remember much about the service. Mostly I was people watching. Then came the moment no one there will ever forget. The rabbi, a white-haired eminence, was winding up a soft-spoken eulogy when out of nowhere someone behind me bellowed, "He murdered the Rosenbergs, let him rot in hell." For a split second, it felt like a bomb had detonated. The elderly grandees gasped, ducked, lurched. I recovered in time to turn around and see an old shabby figure calmly stride out of the sanctuary. The rabbi, a seasoned pro, recovered and went on. After the service, out there on Madison Avenue, 2 or 3 people were parading in a little circle, holding signs, picketing in the icy cold. I was dumbstruck. Protesting a dead man from the grainy, gray and white yesteryear of the McCarthy era? I was 25, and to me they might as well have been screaming, "Remember the Maine." I couldn't believe actual living people still cared, still hated the man enough to find and infiltrate his funeral and hound him one last time, literally into the grave. Justice Felix Frankfurter once said that being forgotten is, quote, the fate of all but very, very few judges. At least my old boss, Irving Robert Kaufman, was one of the few. In 1951, Kaufman wrangled to get the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, charged with stealing the, quote, secret of the atomic bomb and handing it to the monstrous Joseph Stalin. He was 40, one of the youngest federal judges in America, and only 16 months in office. During the trial, he often intervened in ways that helped the government. Upstairs in his chambers, he conducted secret ex parte meetings with prosecutors, including the infamous Roy Cohn. No one knows what they discussed. Once jurors convicted, he deftly advertised his anguish over the sentence and alluded to solitary soul-searching in his empty, dimly lit synagogue. Quote, "I shall approach my task with deep humility," he'd written the president on his appointment. Quote, "For to judge a man is almost a divine prerogative." Now the hour for judgment had come. But his lonely meditations didn't end in mercy. Instead, he condemned the young couple to die in the electric chair in Sing Sing and blasted them for nothing less than igniting the Korean War. Quote, "Who knows but that millions more innocent people may pay the price of your treason," he thundered before a spellbound Manhattan courtroom. Carried out 2 years later, despite a frenzied push for clemency that united Picasso and the Pope, the death sentences convulsed America and ratcheted up Cold War tensions. By then, bomb threats had driven Kaufman and his family from their luxurious Park Avenue apartment. The septuagenarian zealots stalking his memorial service were missing something, though. In the years that followed the Rosenberg case, the hanging judge became something few who didn't know and predicted, a progressive stalwart. He was the first federal judge to desegregate a school north of the Mason-Dixon line. After President John F. Kennedy elevated him to the appellate bench, the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, then the second most important federal court in America, his opinions modernized the insanity defense, improved juvenile justice, reformed prisons, shielded conscientious objectors from the jungles of Vietnam. The grateful son of immigrants, he freed the, quote, man without a country, stranded on Ellis Island, and halted Richard Nixon's deportation of John Lennon on bogus drug charges. In a decision called the Brown versus Board of Education of Human Rights Law, he breathed life into a vague, dusty statute from 1789 and permitted victims to bring their foreign torturers to justice in American courtrooms. His greatest mark was on the First Amendment, as he championed the press and free speech in the Pentagon Papers case, a landmark libel suit against 60 Minutes, and other path-breaking decisions. Again and again, civil liberties lawyers would think of the martyred Rosenbergs and blanch on learning Kaufman was one of the 3 judges assigned to decide their appeal, only to turn ecstatic when he ruled in their favor. Grace withheld from the Rosenbergs overflowed toward others, the weak, the excluded, the unpopular. So the fierce living passion aroused that day by the old, dead Irving Kaufman poses a riddle about judicial schizophrenia. How did the man responsible for 2 of the most infamous executions in American history become one of the most illustrious liberal jurists of his time? The question is what 2 historians have called the, quote, enigma of the Rosenbergs judge, a figure typically but wrongly caricatured as nothing more than a minor, bloodthirsty, supporting cast member in the morality play of McCarthyism. Kaufman's clamorous send-off also reflected the wages of an extraordinarily tumultuous judicial life, one produced by a superheated energy and frantic ambition. Quote, "My entire career has been one dominated by a sense of urgency," he confided to a family member. In his first 4 decades, he rose from nothing to national hero. Most people thought the Rosenbergs got what they deserved, and newspapers and congressmen hailed his courage in defying communist bullying and lunatic death threats. Little seemed to block his path to the, quote, Jewish seat on the Supreme Court. But gradually, over the second 40 years, the terror of atomic annihilation and the red baiting dissipated, and a deferred and scornful howl went up over what had happened to the Rosenbergs. In the 1970s, the couple's orphan sons came of age and led a new generation's crusade to expose the government's, quote, frame-up of their parents, charges made all too plausible by the stream of official lies in Vietnam and Watergate. When FBI records revealed Kaufman's private dealings with the prosecution, it was suddenly 1953 again. Dogged by new threats and strident protesters, denounced in print and faced with calls for impeachment, he lived under siege. His haunting by the eternally young couple bubbled to the surface in defensive outbursts to people he hardly knew, and in a relentless, decades-long secret campaign to counter and muzzle his critics. I saw it in the sad, creased, oxidized brown index cards I found on his desk in 1991, quoting praise from the Rosenbergs' lawyer almost half a century earlier. Life in this pressure cooker exacted its toll. One of Kaufman's sons was in the synagogue that morning to say farewell, but 2 were absent. They'd predeceased Kaufman after decades of substance abuse, paternal haranguing, and in one case, mental illness. Dominated by the husband she'd married at 19, Kaufman's wife Helen suffered her own travails, alcoholism, anorexia, and attempted suicide. Misery shadowed the family's gilded lives among New York's Jewish elite, and few in the know chalk that up to coincidence. For most who do it, judging offers one of life's quieter, cloistered pursuits. Quote, "By and large, judges lead unspectacular lives," wrote one profile of the revered Judge Learned Hand in 1946. Their careers, like broad plateaus, are unmarked by gullies and hills. For Kaufman, however, the judicial calling formed a backdrop to heartache and collateral damage. What began as a dazzling and precocious self-made success, a sprint toward the summit of legal power, ended largely in self-inflicted tragedy, just as the letter writers and funeral picketers wanted. Despite judges' importance, our system seems to anonymize them, from uniform black robes to Delphic pronouncements in legalese. Yet temperament and inner life are among the key forces that contribute to judicial outcomes, though all the attention usually goes to ideology or political background. As one legal philosopher said famously long ago, quote, "There is no guarantee of justice except the personality of the judge." Or as Kaufman himself put it, quote, "Justice is administered by human beings." And Kaufman, the man, defiantly refused to recede into bureaucratic obscurity. Judges, especially appellate ones, are usually thought of as reactive, dispassionate, reserved, Olympian, contemplative. For better and worse, Kaufman was the opposite: active, hyper-energetic, combative, consumed with image and power-hungry. At a bantamweight 5 feet 4 inches, he disappeared into his leather-backed chair, leaving a head barely visible above the bench. His deep, loud, gravelly, heavily accented New York voice had to do the work, and it never failed to make itself heard. In court, the fleshy face with its broad and mashed-up nose and curled-down lower lip often formed what Roy Cohn called a, quote, intimidating leer. Until Gray emerged victorious in his 60s, his hair was thick and black and slicked back. He placed great stock in appearances, looking British and thinking Yiddish. And his dark 3-piece suit was always well-tailored with cufflinks and pocket square to boot. To those squirming under his thumb, clerks, secretaries, lawyers who didn't measure up, he was tyrannical, a grenade waiting to explode. One ex-clerk I called said simply, quote, "That was the worst year of my life and I don't want to talk about it." Another cried in the bathroom so often that when Kaufman learned where she was, he decided she must be drinking too much water and ordered it banned from chambers. As for her co-clerk, Kaufman raised himself up on tiptoes and shouted in his face so rabidly that the clerk thought to himself, "I think I'm going to hit this guy," and wondered if that was a federal crime. That was when Kaufman was 80, after a triple bypass and a year from death. Before I even started, I heard about the time he got a call from security downstairs, after which he quietly put on his coat and left the office. A few minutes later, a marshal called back and was astonished that one of the clerks picked up the phone. Quote, "Didn't the judge tell you about the bomb threat?" the man asked. Of course he hadn't. Kaufman had wanted them to keep grinding. Was that story true? Who knows? The point is, it was believable. Quote, "Fundamentally, he was not a nice person," an earlier clerk acknowledged. Yet Dr. Jekyll was there too, always. To friends and peers, he was affectionate and dependable. A few clerks adroitly navigated the tantrums and emerged close confidants with a powerful and eager backer in their corner. His eye could twinkle as he charmed listeners with jokes delivered with, quote, "the polish of a Catskills comedian," as one former clerk put it. Gregarious and charismatic when he thought it was worth the effort, he could and did seize the spotlight in rooms full of more prominent people. In 1977, a reporter assigned to profile Kaufman found herself defeated and eventually gave up, telling her editor, quote, "I could not come to terms with all of the ambivalent feelings Irving Kaufman provoked. A man with a devouring passion for publicity and one who also calls up a kind of sympathy for the raw nerves, the warmth that are also a part of him. This is the stuff from which novels are made, not Times Magazine pieces," end quote. Or as one anonymous lawyer summarized Kaufman for a guide to the federal judiciary, he's courageous, outspoken, opinionated, articulate, usually right, and not much loved. Memoranda between judges at the Second Circuit were addressed to recipients using their initials. Kaufman was IRK, Irk. Everyone agreed it fit him perfectly. So I would like now to just talk a little more informally about the Jewish dimension, given where we are, of Judge Kaufman, his life story, and of course of the Rosenberg case, which was a particularly Jewish episode. Judge Kaufman's story growing up, his early life, is very much the kind of classic one that we think of when we think of the American Jewish history, and especially in New York. His family came to the United States from Galicia, arriving in 1904. Judge Kaufman was born in 1910, lived in a tenement on the Lower East Side. Shortly after that, the family moved to what was then Jewish Harlem, which was sort of fast becoming its own kind of ghetto, even though the precincts were a little nicer and closer to the park. There's a family story in the Kaufman family that's trickled all the way down to the current generation, and that, according to that story, Judge Kaufman's mother sat down Isidore, young Isidore. He was not Irving. He changed his name like a lot of Americans did to sort of Americanize, and his two older brothers. And she turned to the oldest in this group and said, "You're going to be a doctor." Turned to the middle one and said, "You're going to be a dentist." And Isidore, the third, turned to her right to Isidore and said, "You like to talk a lot, so you're going to be a lawyer." And that came exactly true. There was a doctor, a dentist, and young Isidore was a lawyer. And what the person who relayed that story to me, what he took away from it, he was a nephew of Judge Kaufman's who told me that. What he took away from it was these people were in desperate straits, and they looked around and they realized that the only way out of there, and of course this is so familiar to the American Jewish story, the only way out of there was education. And Judge Kaufman instantly began racing through the public school system of New York. He graduated high school at 16 from a high school called DeWitt Clinton, which is a famous large school in New York, now in the Bronx. At that time it was in Hell's Kitchen, what's now Hell's Kitchen in the 50s. So Jewish that Kaufman's brother referred to it as David Clinton. So he graduated at 16, and now he has to go to college. And I think many of you will know what the typical thing to do if you were essentially a penniless Jewish kid in New York City at that time was when it came to go to college. City College, CCNY, of course. Now, so I learned in the course of doing this that the nickname for CCNY is Circumcised Citizens of New York. And this is the one place where Judge Kaufman's story actually kind of diverges from the typical Jewish trajectory that we all know. He didn't go to CCNY. He went to Fordham. And the reason he went to Fordham was because his older brother had gone to Fordham. And why had his older brother gone to Fordham instead of CCNY? That was because the older brother, the one who became a doctor, did not want to be another Jewish kid applying to medical school from CCNY. So he looked for anything that might distinguish him, and he went to Fordham. He went to the Jesuits. And Kaufman did too. And at that time, Fordham was a pretty insular, heavily Irish Catholic place. And it's up in the Bronx, beautiful campus up in the Bronx, as it has been since the 19th century. But that's not where Kaufman went, because in the 1920s, Fordham was reaching out to the new and expanding city. It had a sort of outreach program to all the kids in Manhattan and lower, and that was called Downtown Fordham. It was in the Woolworth building. And Downtown Fordham was a very different place than Bronx Fordham, because Downtown Fordham had a lot of Jewish kids, a lot of black kids, a lot of women. Fordham's, as everywhere, Fordham's enrollment had plummeted during World War I, and they wanted to replace the men, and so they started admitting a lot more women, even into the graduate schools. And so that was an extremely kind of diverse environment that reflected this expanding and growing city. It also offered a lot of classes at night, so the kids that had to work during the day had a place to go. So Kaufman graduated there in 1931. Again, racing through school, he combined, as you could do then in a few places, an undergraduate degree with a graduate degree, and got out in 5 years instead of 7. And that landed him in a place that, in a way, his speed had sort of worked against him, because he was too young to take the bar exam in New York. And so he had to actually, of course, in the sort of mode that would follow him throughout the rest of his life, he did not like to take no for an answer. And so he used what minimal family and political connections he could muster and tried to get the chief judge of New York State to waive that rule on his behalf. And at that time, unlike the rest of his later life, he didn't quite have the power to make it happen, so the answer was no. Then he had to sort of busy himself for a while before he could practice law. And in 1931, the prospects for Jewish kids coming out of law schools were not great, and not exactly what we think of them as today. And in part, of course, that's because it was the middle of the Great Depression, and in part because the law firms in New York City, the established ones, the larger ones, the ones that cater to Wall Street, were not taking Jewish kids. And so those law graduates, typically, they did a survey at the time, 2/3 of them had no choice but to go into a solo practice, to just set out their own shingle and try to make a living. In that survey I referred to, they interviewed some of these recent Jewish law graduates, and one of them referred to his law degree as a dignified road to starvation. Kaufman was luckier in the sense that he got a job with an established Jewish lawyer who had 2 or 3 other lawyers working for him, actually a man named Rosenberg. No connection, of course, to the more famous Rosenbergs we're going to talk about in a minute. But he worked for Louis Rosenberg, who was a successful real estate lawyer. And by virtue of being a real estate lawyer, perhaps Louis Rosenberg was also politically connected into the Tammany Hall machine in New York City of that day and age. And that proved helpful when Irving wanted his next job, which was in the U.S. Attorney's Office. At that time, Roosevelt had named a U.S. attorney who was a Catholic lay leader who looked very favorably on Fordham grads, which was quite different from the previous iteration of the office, which only hired from the Ivy Leagues. So a lot of things sort of coalesced to make it possible for Irving to get this job in the government, which he'd always wanted. And that truly changed his life. He was no longer a sort of, anonymous lawyer from a kind of average law school. His grades had been fairly middling in college and law school. And suddenly he was in this prominent job that put him in the public eye, and he really made the most of it. He handled these spectacular fraud cases that landed him on the front pages in New York. And when he graduated that office in 1940, he was almost a public figure, often compared to that other kind of skyrocketing young prosecutor who was becoming politically successful in the era, Thomas Dewey. In fact, Kaufman was, because he was so young, he'd gotten to all these positions at a very early age. He was kind of especially baby-faced anyway, and he was quite young regardless. And so his people, his friends and his wife, had encouraged him to solve this problem when he was talking to jurors who might regard him as a kind of well-meaning college graduate by growing a Tom Dewey-esque mustache, which if anyone has a mental image of Tom Dewey, which not many people have today, was a little sort of mustache right in the middle there. And Kaufman wisely rejected the suggestion and never did that, but was always taken as a sort of patronized and taken as a younger, person who jurors couldn't quite figure out why he was up there talking to them. So he leaves that office, and he's quite successful, and he starts a law practice with some fellow prosecutors. But again, he doesn't have entree to the large corporate business, to financial business. So he carves out a quite successful practice representing people very much like himself, which is to say Jewish, self-made, outsiders, people on the make. And so his clients become Sam Newhouse of the Newhouse Publishing Group, at a time when the Newhouse Group is growing and acquiring newspapers, quite successful to Kaufman's later career. He represents a company started by the Shine family, S-C-H-I-N-E. They owned a series of hotels and theaters. But those pale in comparison, although they were powerful and well-known in the Jewish community and becoming well-known outside the Jewish community, they pale in comparison to his main client in the private sector in the 40s, Milton Berle. He represents the famous comedian, Mr. Television, and that is something that the ever politically motivated Irving Kaufman uses to his advantage, not just because Milton Berle is a household name or becoming one, but because he can use it to curry favor with the politicians he wants to support his other ambition, which is to become a judge. So Kaufman is a sort of protege of J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, who he'd come to know a little bit as a prosecutor and had bombarded with flattery and other attention since leaving the office in an effort to become even more well-known to Hoover and to have Hoover advance his career. And he was also a protege of Tom Clark, who was a member of the Truman administration in the Justice Department and eventually became Attorney General. If you want to become a federal judge, you can't really do better than becoming known to the Attorney General himself and the head of the FBI. And Kaufman did that in part by using Milton Berle. He would hand out tickets to Milton Berle's events. He would have Milton Berle headline a fundraiser and invite the director to come. So he played the political game very successfully, so much so that he becomes a judge, as I said in the prologue, one of the youngest in America, second youngest when he's appointed at only age 39 in 1949. And very soon, within only a few months, he's presiding over a case that will lead him to the Rosenberg trial. The first case he presided over related to the Rosenberg case is not the Ethel and Julius espionage trial. It's a trial of a man named Abe Rothman and Miriam Moskowitz. These are people truly unknown today who the government suspected of being in on this espionage plot that was beginning to come into view in New York City with a number of figures. But they couldn't ever charge them with espionage, so they had to charge them with lying to the grand jury. And Kaufman presides over that trial and throws the book at them and gives them the most serious sentence. And of course, the government takes note of that and wouldn't mind having him as their trial judge in the Rosenberg case, which is coming along. Everybody regarded the Moskowitz and Rothman trial as a sort of dry run for the Rosenberg case. But you may be asking yourself, well, so what if the government might want that? Aren't judges randomly assigned? Well, in that day and in that court, that wasn't quite true. Without belaboring the sort of mechanics behind the scenes, the government did have some ability to choose the judge by virtue of how it scheduled the case coming along in the system. And the clerk of the circuit could assign the trial of individual cases to different judges, even if they'd had nothing previously to do with the case. So there was some discretion in the hands of the clerk that could be manipulated a little bit by the government in terms of its scheduling, and also by the judges themselves. So Judge Kaufman badly wanted this case because he realized its potential to make him a national figure. And so he reached out to get it, and his tool for doing that, his means was Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was a junior prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office at the time. And Roy Cohn, although only in his early 20s and newly graduated from Columbia, was a little like Judge Kaufman, who became a sort of mentor to Cohn to some degree, in that he curried favor with powerful figures inside the courthouse, inside the U.S. Attorney's Office, He was far more than just a junior prosecutor, as others might have been in his position. And that was also because his father, Roy Cohn's father, was politically influential. Roy Cohn's father had been a sort of high lieutenant in the Bronx Democratic Party machine, and had gotten people jobs and patronage positions and judgeships. So everybody knew Roy Cohn's father, Al Cohn, in the courthouse, and everybody knew Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn went to the clerk at Judge Kaufman's urging and was able to manipulate the assignment such that Kaufman got the case. So the case, as you know, is an exceptionally Jewish one. The reason for that, the judge was Jewish, the defendants, of course, were Jewish, the prosecutors were Jewish, not just Roy Cohn, but the head United States attorney, meaning Irving Sapol. And it was in New York, and it was regarded as a sort of Jewish case. This was really highlighted by a juror who was interviewed in the 1970s, looked back and said, and this juror, of course, is not Jewish. That was the one place in the case where you wouldn't find any Jews on the jury. There were no Jews on the jury, even though it was New York City, which later became a kind of charge against its unfairness. How could you have a major trial in New York City and have no Jews on the jury? So this juror said, quote, "I felt good that this was strictly a Jewish show. It was Jew against Jew. It wasn't the Christians hanging the Jews." So it was seen as a Jewish event, and the Jewish community, of course, was on edge about the indictment and prosecution of the Rosenbergs. And that's because of the sort of historic trope of anti-Semitism which identified Jews as communists over what, as the ranks of the communists being filled disproportionately by Jews, and communism in these sort of imaginings of a certain slice of anti-Semites as a Jewish creation. This was really summarized by the playwright Arthur Miller, who wrote the following. He spoke of, quote, "the anxiety in myself, to be candid about it, the worry and the chill of unquiet that there had been so many Jews noticeable in the left over the past decades. So I could understand the perhaps special need Jews could have, their very complicated desire to show that they too were patriotic Americans." And that, of course, gets to the heart of the charge that was made against Judge Kaufman after he sentenced the Rosenbergs to death, which is that he had done so to demonstrate Jewish patriotism and Jewish loyalty, that he'd bent over backwards to be severe against the Rosenbergs and give them the maximum ultimate penalty in order to show the world, essentially for appearance's sake, in order to show the world that there were no loyal or more loyal Jews, no more loyal Americans than Jewish Americans. So I want to talk about that for a minute, and if you'll indulge me with a little bit more reading, just a couple of more paragraphs. This is a sort of thing I wanted to get to really in the book. What was Judge Kaufman's motivation for sentencing the Rosenbergs to death? Was it just to communicate to the wider world that Jews were patriotic? Well, I ultimately don't think so. I think that can't be eliminated entirely. He was a political actor. He was someone who cared a lot about appearances, but I think it ran much deeper than that. Not only was his anti-communism kind of especially vitriolic as a protege of Hoover and also a graduate of the kind of conservative environment of Fordham, but I think it got to the heart of what he thought about Jews in America. So let me, if you don't mind, let me read just a bit more. Whatever Kaufman's concern for appearances, he didn't have to manufacture his patriotic outrage. It was genuine. At his core, there was an inevitable revulsion for two people who had once been just like him, but then spurned everything he stood for. Kaufman and the Rosenbergs had all been poor Jews on the Lower East Side, second-generation children of refugees from the dark eastern lands. Julius was born in Kaufman's old neighborhood, Jewish Harlem, a few months after the Kaufmans arrived. For a while, their paths were the same, acclimating to America in an immigrant family, enduring privation, loosening religious strictures, passing through the city's public schools. In short, the second generation. But then the road forked. Kaufman reached for and grasped the lifeline extended, however inconsistently and grudgingly, to Jews and other newcomers. Success, according to the well-established rules of the American game. With no regard at all for his religion or meager background, a Catholic university had generously taken him in and trained him. The government had hired him and sent him into court in the greatest city of the world to represent the American people. He'd piled up money through law and business, and his family lived well on New York's most prestigious boulevard. He was welcomed into party politics and rewarded again with promotion to higher government office in the Capitol. And all this was just a prelude to realizing his ultimate ambition, a seat on the bench. Quote, "This can only happen in America," he had gushed after his appointment, and he was more or less right. To the Rosenbergs, though, Kaufman's road was a mirage. Unlike most Jews, they hadn't yet made it out of the ghetto. The American dream they saw was a put-on invented by those at the top to mask widespread class exploitation, violence against racial minorities, and imperialism abroad. Outraged by local labor disputes, the Tom Mooney case, the Scottsboro Boys, and other injustices, they had started down the other path trod by American Jews toward a different dream, a new system to serve the masses, not just the talented strivers. America was a, quote, callous society, they wrote one another from prison, where so-called honorable men in power duped and suppressed the people. Quote, world cartels controlled by finance capital, end quote, ran the government, and, quote, appointed as errand boys men such as Sapol and Kaufman, end quote. In fact, to Julius, Kaufman and his ilk from Park Avenue and the City Athletic Club were nothing less than the Judenrat, the German word for the Jewish council the Nazis formed to facilitate their genocide, and a term Julius often used to pillory the established Jewish leadership and press. To the Rosenbergs, Kaufman's American dream was hollow and corrupt. The chasm between these two different outlooks was vast and all-encompassing. Whether Kaufman was fully conscious of it or not, this is what he meant when he charged the Rosenbergs at sentencing with wanting to destroy America. It was his America they wanted to end. The Promised Land Jews like him had searched out for millennia and finally found. In the end, this was Abe Rothman's and Miriam Moskowitz's and Julius Rosenberg's and Ethel Rosenberg's and Morton Sobel's true offense. Quote, judges are not saints, Kaufman himself wrote decades later, quote, and they are subject to influences they are not aware exist. For example, judges may allow their subconscious social prejudices to lead them, end quote. In 1952, as the Rosenbergs' executions were approaching and Kaufman was under pressure to reduce their sentences, Helen wrote him a note to buck up his spirits. Though written 21 months after the trial, it exposes the thinking at work all along. Irving, dear, don't let the commies get you down. Keep remembering, they are trying to undermine the safety of our country. Where could we go from here? Be strong and just roll with the punches. We all love and admire you. Where indeed, for Kaufman and all the other lucky Jews, there was nowhere left after America. So in that passage, I tried to get at what I really thought was animating Judge Kaufman when he sentenced the Rosenbergs to death, which is a betrayal of him personally, beyond simply a betrayal of the United States. Of course, in addition to the sentence, there were other sort of Jewish elements, like I referred before in the prologue to Judge Kaufman sort of publicly letting it be known that he had meditated in a synagogue. That sort of injected Judaism into things. And after the sentences, which were broadly popular, as I said, when they were first pronounced, a slow movement began to build before the Rosenbergs' executions about 2 years later to oppose the sentences and to induce at first Judge Kaufman, and if he wouldn't agree, the White House to extend clemency to the Rosenbergs and to commute their sentences. And of course, this being a Jewish case, that program and that movement was started by a Jewish woman, Emily Altman, a lawyer in New York. She started a committee to reduce the sentences of the Rosenbergs, and at first it seemed like a sort of quixotic errand with only a little bit of support in New York. But gradually it built into a movement around the country and ultimately before the executions around the world. And a lot of the people in that movement were Jews who were made uncomfortable by the sentences and who thought that their severity and their finality would only attract further negative attention to the Jewish community. One of these people was an Orthodox rabbi named Meyer Scharf, who was in Williamsburg, New York. And he said in a passage that was widely quoted, quote, if Judge Kaufman really wanted to know what an honest Jew would have done, he need not have gone to a synagogue. He could have walked in any street in New York and asked 10 good Jews. A lot of people emphasize that the Jewish response to capital punishment historically has been negative. And there's the story, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, Rabbi, so pardon that, but I think it is in the Sanhedrin. In order to impose a sentence, it had to be unanimous, is that right? And effectively, that meant that there really was no tradition or approval of capital punishment in the Jewish tradition, in the Jewish world. And other Jews who didn't particularly like it, for example, included Felix Frankfurter. Felix Frankfurter wrote to Learned Hand, a famous judge in New York. Frankfurter was watching the case. The case eventually came to the Supreme Court. Frankfurter dissented from the court's refusal to hear the case. He eventually dissented from what passed for a kind of late approval of the case right before the executions. And privately, he was outraged by Judge Kaufman's sort of public advertisement of the Jewish connection and his Jewish faith when it came to considering what to do about the Rosenbergs. Judge Kaufman wrote the following, Justice Frankfurter wrote the following to Learned Hand, quote, "I despise a judge who feels God told him to impose a death sentence, or any, and K, Kaufman, is an ass kisser to boot. I am mean enough to try to stay here long enough so that Kaufman will be too old to succeed me." That didn't quite work out, as I'll discuss in a second. The Rosenbergs, of course, were executed in 1953, and for a time, the pressure on Judge Kaufman declined. The sort of case cropped back up when it came to Judge Kaufman's desire to be promoted. As I'd said, Judge Kaufman had reached out for this case. He wanted the case. He saw it as a vehicle for his ambition to sort of ascend the ladder in the federal judicial system. And for a while that he had powerful political supporters in the Senate and elsewhere, and he was hoping to use that as a vehicle of advancement. Even in the Eisenhower administration, which was unusual because Judge Kaufman was a Democrat and had been appointed by President Truman. So it was unexpected and unlikely that President Eisenhower would promote him to the Court of Appeals. But a campaign was launched to do just that by his supporters in politics and in the Senate as a sort of reward for the trauma that he had endured, the death threats, the sort of public pressure of the clemency movement, even though it never represented a majority of Americans, and the degree to which that was itself a sort of Jewish project was revealed in a letter to President Eisenhower from a man named Julius Klein. Julius Klein was a sort of mover and shaker in the Jewish political world. He'd been head of the Jewish Veterans Association. He was a friend of Eisenhower's, and he wrote President Eisenhower the following, trying to encourage the president to reward Judge Kaufman with a promotion. He said, quote, "We are all proud of Judge Kaufman, not only because he is a great jurist, but for his courage in sending the Rosenberg traitors to the electric chair. I was one of many loyal Americans of Jewish faith who urged you at that time not to show clemency to these people who had betrayed our country." To Jacob Javits, who was a new Jewish senator from New York, Julius Klein, also friendly with Javits, was a little more candid. He said, quote, "Because of what Kaufman did in the Rosenberg case, we American Jews can walk erect on main streets in America. My only interest in Kaufman is the patriotic one. It means nothing to me, but it means a lot to our people." So the idea was promoting Kaufman would be good for the Jews, essentially. And it didn't work. It ran up against roadblocks, not least Justice Frankfurter, who had some influence with the Justice Department in the Eisenhower administration, and others who lobbied against it. And it didn't happen until President Kennedy took over in 1961. Then Justice Kaufman was promoted because the court expanded and there were some additional seats, and he was able to achieve promotion. Then, as I said in the prologue, Judge Kaufman became a sort of exemplar of what some who've written about Jews in law in the 20th century have called the Jewish judge. And what that means is he became a traditional sort of progressive. This is the Jewish judicial tradition, beginning with Brandeis and running really through Ruth Bader Ginsburg and arguably on today through others at the Supreme Court. Certainly at lower court levels, There were appellate judges who followed that progressive tradition that generally wanted reform in criminal areas, generally promoted civil rights. That's the sort of judge Judge Kaufman was for the following decades of his career. But even as that happened, and even as he achieved some renown for that, the Rosenberg case dogged him really till the end. As I mentioned in the prologue, the case sort of roared back to life in the 1970s when there were revelations of these earlier ex parte contacts he had had. The Rosenbergs' children came of age and led this campaign to clear their parents' names. They were compelling public figures. It was in the 1970s when a lot of faith in institutions like the FBI and the Justice Department and the federal government had declined. And so Judge Kaufman became a sort of hunted kind of figure, denounced in the New York, his kind of favorite place, the New York Times. People urged impeachment. And the controversy never really quite went away. And that was true, as I explained, even at his funeral. It dogged him to the very end. Raising the sort of question, ultimately, was Judge Kaufman good for the Jews? And I'll just close with, these are remarks from a writer named Neil Carlin, wrote a book called The Story of Yiddish a few years ago. And he said the following: "Who can explain a tribe that holds to its chest Dr. Albert B. Sabin, inventor of the polio vaccine, but also has to count as its own Roy Cohn and Judge Irving Kaufman, who illegally conspired in chambers to convict Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, largely so that the case would go down as good for the Jews." So the book tries to address whether that's ultimately true, and it's a mixed verdict at best. So thanks very much. Yes. Yeah, so I clerked for him from 1991 to 1992, as I say in the book, right? Yeah, right at the very end of his career. It's supposed to be a year-long job. It was only 6 months because he died about 6 months in. He certainly didn't discuss the case with me, and law clerks knew well to avoid that topic and not to raise it with him. I did have to raise it with him once, which was when a book, and that's putting it loosely, came into chambers that had been written by someone who had no real affiliate, no sort of seemed like a kind of nobody. It was not affiliated, not a scholar, not an academic, not a lawyer, just someone who became interested in the case and wrote this. And it was self-published. And if you began looking through it, it really was just mostly what this person had done is reprint the kind of trial transcript. So it was actually quite large, but there was really nothing much in it. But this person had sent it to all the other judges in the courthouse, and that was the kind of thing that would deeply embarrass and concern Judge Kaufman. So I had to call him and tell him that this thing had come into chambers, and that, other judges had received it. And that did not lead to a conversation about the Rosenberg case, but he just sort of muttered something along the lines of, won't this ever go away? Or I can't believe this is, still around. And that was that. Yes?
I read that his two sons changed their names. And this is whatever happened to them?
Well, you mean Judge Kaufman's sons did, the Rosenbergs, yes. The Rosenbergs, right, so they were raised by a different family, Abel Meerpole. Abel Meerpole was a music teacher and a songwriter in New York, actually famous for writing the song Strange Fruit, recorded by Billie Holiday, a song about lynching. Funny, Abel Meerpole was a teacher at DeWitt Clinton High School, at the same place that Judge Kaufman had gone to. And Abel Meerpole was also a communist. And he took in the Rosenbergs' children. The Rosenbergs family, the wider family, did not really want these young kids because of the embarrassment and the spotlight that was on them after years of the Rosenbergs and their treachery being in the news. So the kids ended up with the Meerpole family, and they have said and written over the years that the Meerpoles provided a very loving home environment. And as they grew up in their adolescence, they did not tell many people who they really were, including friends of theirs. And it wasn't until the late 1960s that changed. And it changed because a lawyer by the name of Louis Nizer wrote a book that it had included some of this prison correspondence between Ethel and Julius. And the kids, who were now in their 20s, felt like this was a kind of theft almost of their family legacy. And so they made a decision: we're going to tell the world who we are, we're going to go public with this, and we're going to clear our parents' names, because they believed not just that these sentences had been excessive, or maybe their parents had not gotten a fully fair trial. They truly believed their parents were innocent. And they set off, as I discussed, just kind of summarized in that prologue, on this long campaign to prove that. And they were compelling and articulate people who made a good case. And of course, if you look over any trial, you'll begin to find holes in it. And there were some holes in this case, or just some curious, unexplained things that you could begin to show seemed kind of curious. So they made the case that the Rosenbergs were innocent, and part of that case required getting documents from the FBI, which in the 1950s and 60s is not something you could do. But Congress then passed and then later strengthened the Freedom of Information Act. And they were one of the first requests in to the FBI after some amendments to FOIA liberalized that and made it possible to get more records from the government. And they got thousands of documents dumped on them, and their lawyer went through it. And one of the Rosenbergs so I interviewed the Rosenberg kids for this book, and he told me they were off on a speaking tour, one of their speaking tours about the case, and their lawyer called them up and said, "You really need to get back here to New York, because these documents show that the judge colluded with the prosecution." And they immediately held a press conference, and the focus of the campaign became as much not just our parents are innocent, but this is judicial corruption. And they were wrongly convicted because of a judge who violated his oath and colluded with prosecutors. So that campaign petered out a bit in the 1980s. And then in the early 90s, with revelations after the demise of the Soviet Union, there began to be more sort of reliable information that Julius had in fact spied for the Soviet Union. That was confirmed with the sort of public dissemination of information learned by the federal government from the Soviet code, which America had broken during the war. That was called Project Venona. And that's, in fact, what led the government to Julius Rosenberg in the first place as a suspect. Of course, they didn't disclose that in the trial because they didn't want to tell the world that they knew the Soviets' code. So Julius Rosenberg, it is confirmed, spied for the Soviets. Whether Ethel was really a part of that? Yeah, Ethel, it's not confirmed by Venona. The test, as many of you may know if you followed the case over the years, the testimony that convicted Ethel at trial, and Julius, but especially Ethel, came from her own brother, a guy named David Greenglass, who was part of this conspiracy. He testified that Ethel had typed up the notes, that information from David was the one at Los Alamos, that he came back with information about the bomb. They needed to hand it to the Russians, and it had to be legible. So Ethel supposedly typed the notes. In the 1990s, he admitted that he lied about that. That was perjured testimony. And he did that to protect his own wife, who was also part of this conspiracy. So, well, yeah.
My husband grew up in New York, and his name is Rosenberg.
Oh.
We had a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Not my name is Rosenberg.
Yeah. I can imagine. Yeah. Yes. Yes, Justice Frankfurter, well, as I said, he was on the bench in 1953 when the case came to the court. It's a whole separate saga of the Supreme Court's mishandling of that case. In fact, it's the subject of its own book. Certain members of the court changed their votes about whether to hear the case or not. It was a sort of travesty. Frankfurter was one of the very few, only two, if I'm remembering correctly, who consistently thought this is an important enough case to review. We should review this case. And he wrote a short dissent. At that time, the laws did not permit much appellate review of sentencing. So under its own precedent, even the Supreme Court couldn't really revise a trial sentence except under extraordinary conditions. And Frankfurter went to lengths in his short written dissent to not approve the sentence, to tell the public, we essentially have no control over this sentence and do not read our refusal to hear the case as an approval. of these sentences. So he was on the bench, and he was on the bench in the later 50s when Kaufman was trying to advance, and he was maneuvering to block him in favor of a candidate, a guy named Henry Friendly, who went on to become a very eminent federal judge, also Jewish. And Frankfurter died in early 60s, 61, 63, I forget what year exactly. And that was one of the seats that Judge Kaufman hoped to fill. And at that time, President Kennedy was not fully persuaded we needed to maintain this tradition of the Jewish seat that had started with Brandeis and continued through Frankfurter. And as it happened, he did appoint a Jewish member of the court, Arthur Goldberg, who was a kind of political ally of his. Kaufman never really received very serious consideration for the Supreme Court, in part because the Rosenberg case, was controversial, even though, as I said, I think until the 1970s, still kind of widely approved, but still some element of controversy. And he wasn't seen as sort of on the scholarly and intellectual level of someone like Henry Friendly, who was Jewish and was considered, nor did he have quite the political juice of a guy like Arthur Goldberg. And then when it came to LBJ, he wanted to put his lawyer friend Abe Fortas on the court, and he also wanted to appoint the first African-American of the court, Thurgood Marshall. So they never quite worked out for Judge Kaufman. I will, if you'll let me, I'll tell you a quick funny story about that. So his desire to be on the court, Judge Kaufman, was so transparent to his colleagues. Everybody knew, that's what he wanted and had tried as he could to maneuver for that. Of course, by 1980, he was too old. He was 70 years old. But 1980, in the presidential campaign of 1980, President Reagan, candidate Reagan, had told the country that he would appoint the first woman justice. He made that a campaign pledge. And very immediately in his administration, he got an appointment, and that appointment became Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman appointed to the court. But right after Reagan was elected and before Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed, and it was in the press that we were very likely to get our first woman justice, there was a meeting, a luncheon of the judges in the Second Circuit in their usual judges' dining room in New York. Judge Kaufman wasn't there. And one of the judges said to one of the others in a sort of loud whisper that everybody could hear, "I hear Irving's wearing a dress." So a little humor at his expense over his transparent desire to be on the court. Yeah.
So I'm going to, if I can, give a little my own flavor of this before I get to the question. I grew up as the child of the female version of Judge Kaufman. She graduated from the New York City Public High School at the age of 14, not 16, and got a master's degree in math at the age of 18.
Oh my.
A very liberal Jewish family. I was a little kid at the time, a little spring chicken now, but was very, it was the conversation at the dinner table when I was 6 and 7 years old every single night about the Rosenbergs.
Oh, wow.
So with a little bit of that as the background, and maybe to not ramble on, apparently Kaufman was friends with J. Edgar Hoover.
Yes.
The Schein family, if that's the same Schein family.
It is, the one who became the Roy Cohn confidant, yeah.
Those are not good people.
Well, that's the general view, yes. Yes, of course.
And one could say that, as you did actually, only in America, think Pinochet and Gaddafi as just a couple of examples. No, not only in America. You can rise to power if you go with the right-wing power.
Sure.
Very easily.
Sure.
So with that said, I would, and even Ruth Ben Gad says in her Strongman book that just came out, the Judenrat that they appointed tended often to be criminals because they were the best ones at imposing morally bankrupt positions on their fellow Holocaust imprisoned and soon to be dead. I would like to know your opinion as a young lawyer who worked for this group here, and your
Yeah.
personal opinion. And I was very aware of what you brought up in one of the answers just now, that Rosenberg, the male, was in fact a spy.
Yes.
Notwithstanding
Sure.
And that Ethel, apparently, the data came out that she didn't make the drawings.
Yeah.
Ethel was executed first, and then they went to her, went to Julius and said, "We've already killed your wife, so you know we're going to kill you in order to try to get him, because apparently you never did." Is that all true?
Yeah,
Admit to what he did.
the government was trying to get them to confess to the very, very end. They had wired up a system at Sing Sing prison to communicate directly to Washington. They interviewed them, tried to interview them relentlessly in prison to get them to confess. And of course, that's one theory, and one that I think has a fair amount of truth behind it, as to why Ethel was sentenced to death as well. It was to pressure Julius to confess, and to some degree to exert pressure on her to confess in order to not orphan her children. And so there's a quote that first appeared in a book by Sam Roberts, a New York Times journalist, from one of the government officials. I forget who it was. I think he was in the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, who also involved in the sort of attempt to confine the espionage and learn about it, and knowledgeable about the Rosenberg case. And he essentially said, they called their bluff. They called their bluff. The Rosenberg kids believed that their parents were especially reluctant to confess because that would have involved naming their friends, who were also, if not spies, at least communists, which was itself then a prosecutable offense. So, yeah.
First time I became aware of Rosenberg was an anti-Semitism class in college. And hearing the comments tonight from you, I don't really see an anti-Semitic connection. To your background, was there?
In other words, was that a reason for the?
Part of it,
No, I mean, and that was, Judge Kaufman was sometimes branded a self-hater, and he'd been too hard. Like, no, I don't think Judge Kaufman was a self-hater. I don't think anti-Semitism wasn't at the root of the case or of the charges. So no, I don't. The irony is that some of when they began attacking the case, some people refer to it as the American Dreyfus case. And as I said, they pointed out the fact that there had been no Jews on the jury. The irony is the Rosenbergs themselves, who were corresponding with each other from prison, in letters that they fully knew would be published. So they read, if you read those letters, they're of course very affecting because of what's coming, which they knew. But when they're not affecting, which is much of the time, they read sort of like communist propaganda, because they very well knew they'd be published, and they wanted the world to believe in their innocence, and they wanted to rally, to the cause. The Rosenbergs very much discouraged a focus on the Jewish angle of the case. They did not see the case or their prosecution as religious persecution. They saw the case and the prosecution as political persecution. They thought they were being made scapegoats because the Soviets had come out with a bomb in 1949 before a lot of people thought they would get it. And so somebody's got to pay for that. And they believed they were being persecuted really for their communism, and because America needed some explanation for how the Russians could have gotten the bomb. They didn't want to emphasize the Jewish angle, but some of their supporters did. Yeah.
You stated that Rosenberg, in fact, was a spy for the Soviets. Is it proven that he did hand over the secret of the atomic bomb to them?
No, well, I would say no, because there is no real secret to the bomb. I mean, what was given to them was some information, to the Soviets, was important information about a component of the bomb called the lens mold. And so, because David Greenglass, his brother-in-law and Ethel's brother, was a machinist at Los Alamos. So he had a fairly low-level education. He was not a scientist or a physicist there. But he was present at Los Alamos, got some information most importantly, about the lens mold, and that's what was given to the Soviet Union. Julius also transmitted other military information not connected with the bomb or Los Alamos to the Soviets. That's another criticism of the case, which I go into in the book, is that in pronouncing the death sentence, Judge Kaufman and others who supported it really overvalued the importance of that information to the bomb. It wasn't unimportant, as some of their critics have charged, but nor can you boil down the effort to develop an atom bomb into, like a sketch on a piece of paper, which is what was given by Greenglass to Rosenberg to the Soviets. I believe they got $500 from the Russians. But it was never, it's funny, Ruth Greenglass testified about that at the trial and said she kept the money and had a lot of problems and didn't feel bad keeping the money. But their espionage was not about money. They were committed, diehard communists, and they believed, charitably anyway, they believed, as some other Americans did, including some who worked on the project of the atomic bomb, that the United States should not have a monopoly on this technology, that it's better, the world will be safer if it's shared. As I said, they were not really alone in that belief. Yeah.
I was a little troubled by the part when you were reading, and I don't know if this is like a theory or a hypothesis, that Judge Kaufman's judgment or sentencing was affected by his thoughts about how the case affected him and his religious community. And it seems to me that we should want judges to make those decisions based upon how all of society is affected.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, law professors love alternative scenarios, and what if the Rosenbergs had given the bomb to Israel, right?
Yeah.
Do you think Kaufman would have given them a different verdict?
I possibly so. Yeah.
What does that say about Kaufman or
Yeah.
how you think judges should rule?
Sure, yeah, and I'll just finish with that. I mean, I think what I meant by that passage was that he viewed, I think, and this is some armchair psychologizing. He viewed them as a sort of viewed it all as a sort of personal betrayal, not just a betrayal of the United States, but a betrayal of he was someone who succeeded so wildly, so quickly, and was so grateful to this country that I think he saw what they did as kind of differently than some other judges might have seen it, as a kind of ordinary act of espionage. He saw it as more treacherous than that, I think, and that appears in some of the. Yes. I don't think he had the objectivity or the neutrality to view their offense in the way that some other judges might have. Having said that, though, it's not to divorce. It's a sort of pipe dream to think you can really divorce the personal, I think, from the judicial, and that's something I try to cover in the book. I mean, and something he acknowledged when he said judges are human beings. They're not machines. This is a case that probably was too close to him to view objectively in the way that we would want. It's also, though, probably true that it would have been hard for the Rosenbergs to find mercy in any courtroom in 1951, given the temper of the times and the Korean War. But they got an especially bad draw, I think, with Judge Kaufman, for sure. So I think we're out of time, but I'm going to sign books. I'd be very happy to discuss the case or,
I just wanted to make a comment about what you said about the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court. So interesting. Not only you got it right about the death penalty. Yeah. So there's a quote, I think I have it right, that says that if the Sanhedrin, which is the highest Jewish court, right, put someone to death once every 7 years, it'd be considered a bloody court. To which the next comment is, no, once even every 70 years. That on one side. On the other end, though, the only law, I believe, repeated in every single book of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is the death penalty. Just food for thought as you sign his book and personalize it. Thank you for coming tonight.